This is the hierarchy lecture for the ART159 graphic design layout class. And today we're going to be talking about the principles of hierarchy and how it is essential to helping readers navigate and find information within your designs. So when we're talking about visual hierarchy, we're talking about the arrangement of graphic elements in a design in the order of importance of each one of those elements. And the visual weight is going to define that importance of each one of the elements within the design's hierarchy. So communicating to a viewer's eyes what to focus on and in what order is going to be the designer's responsibility. Hierarchy is really utilized in the design of this poster that we can see, which is advertising an exhibit that's held at Helsinki by TSTO. And it's done by a variation within the text styling and the imagery that is shown. And there's a clear grouping of information here, which visually guides the viewer from the most important elements, such as the title and the date, to some of the less important elements, such as the supporters of the event and some of the key details that are found at the bottom of the poster. And we can see that done here by the use of size and the type of typography that is being done, and also by the proximity in which it is placed within the composition. You can also see another example of this here, where hierarchy is also utilized very often in packaging, which is very important. When we're thinking about packaging, we're thinking about the consumer's needs to be able to recognize a product on the shelf and understand what it is that they're buying. And we can see from this example from the studio, they're highlighting one focal point, which really draws in the customer. They're utilizing this large numeral here to really show the different stages of this series of products for facial care here. And hierarchy in terms of typography means a consistent styling of similar copy throughout the entire document or image. And in this example here by Studio Dunbar, we have a heading. We also have some intro text. We have a subheader and body copy. And all of these are working together to lead the viewer through the information in the order that the client and the designer intended the viewer to go through. So they're utilizing the typeface Montserrat here. And this was actually designed by Julieta Ulanovsky, based out of Buenos Aires, Argentina. And we can see this beautiful use of color and the size of typography, as well as the weight of the typography, as well as the use of capital letters here to create these large blocks of text that are leading the viewer's eyes from the imagery that we can see into the headline of the event, into some of the smaller body copy. And then at the very bottom, we see some of the logos or the supporters of the event, which are also necessary to have on here, but don't have as strong of a priority as some of the other elements on this poster. So in typography, when we're thinking about hierarchy, it really helps the viewer to know what to read first and the relationships between the different pieces of information presented. So it organizes the elements and communicates the information effectively and in the right order, while also creating a visual impact to the viewer there as well. And it's something that's really important to understand in this course, and it's essential to having clear communication as a designer. When we're working with text, there's usually and almost always a prioritization of how we want things to be read that allows it to be best understood. So if we think about a magazine, for example, you often start with the title or a headline, and if it grabs your interest, you might continue down to the subtitle. And if that continues to pique your interest, you'll jump into the actual body copy or the story itself. And that prioritization really helps you to evaluate whether or not you're interested in what you're looking at. And that process is really a byproduct of strong hierarchy. So when creating hierarchy through typography, we usually suggests using 3 or more levels of organization in your design. And when this is properly executed, we will often find that we can isolate these areas to something along the lines of a headline, a subheadline, and then some sort of body copy. And this rule has been well established, and newspapers and magazines, even from the early to mid 20th century, really loved exaggerating this. And we can see an example of this being used here and how that's kind of broken down. So we use typography to bring attention to such elements as headlines, subheaders, body copy, call to action elements, and captions. And the first level is used to draw the user's attentions to the core information on the screen or within the article. And the second level is then used for elements that can easily be scanned and help users navigate through content. The third level is then used for some sort of body copy and any additional information or data that might be important. So let's see this in action. If you read the content above, you can read it and it provides all the information that the user needs. But if we go in and we apply these 3 levels of hierarchy, we get this sort of enhanced example that we can see here. And what's the difference? Well, the information is much easier to digest, and our eyes can easily scan through this information and pick out the important elements, figuring out what's standing out, drawing the user's attention, and then by organizing and formatting the typography, it enables the viewer to easily navigate the layout at a glance and to quickly find that information that they're looking for. So this depends on some sort of emphasis or dominance within the layout. And when we're talking about emphasis or dominance, typically we're going to be comparing at least 2 or more elements within a design. And either elements can either be equal in every way, or one is going to exert some level of dominance over the other. And the more dominant the element, the more it's going to attract the viewer and get noticed first. So it might even appear to exhibit some sort of control over the less dominant elements within the composition. So the more dominant element likely has greater visual weight than the element it dominates. And it will again seem to exert a force around that additional element. And we can use different principles and elements of design to execute this emphasis and focal points within different designs. So when we're creating dominance, we can think about contrast because emphasis is relative to visual weight. If we have identical items, we can't dominate each other. We need to exert some sort of dominance. So an element has to look different from the other elements in order to create that dominance. So your goal is to create elements with noticeable differences between the visual weights within that layout. That's how we are going to establish this hierarchy. And one way we can do that is by size or the scale of elements. So the larger something is, the more chances it has to stand out. Typically, it's going to be the first thing that the eye will see, and thus it's going to be one of the more important things within the layout as well. In this example here, we can see the large titling of crackling and then the sort of subheader of performance below that. And from there, we continue to navigate to the top right of the composition and read time to act before we get to the actual body text there. So they're utilizing scale here to establish that hierarchy. They're using composition and proximity of these different elements and alignment, but essentially they're really pushing the scale of this titling to have that stand out as the most dominant element within this composition. So is bigger always better? Well, not necessarily, right? Bigger is typically going to be more noticeable, but not always. And the simplest way to explain that is that The most important elements should be the biggest, but it's when we get into the details that it becomes a little bit more complicated. Because keep in mind, although bigger sometimes means more important, you should consider the correct and relevant message in order to hook your viewer into the proper content. So don't just make your element bigger, make sure that it's actually more important, that it's more relevant to help the visual message that's being shown. White space or blank areas within a composition can be just as powerful within hierarchy to build the points of emphasis and dominance, because white space helps to place the focus on other specific elements within the composition as well. We can see this being utilized here in this advertisement for IKEA, and it's this adept use of white space in this specific composition that shows this really minimalistic approach. And it kind of goes into their whole style of their furniture and their products as well. They're really thinking about the conceptual nature of this advertisement and thinking about this very large use of white space to show where this Christmas tree is potentially going to grow, but it's still very early in the season, and they're talking about this early sale that they're having, right? So they're really using that white space to draw the viewer's eyes towards this point of emphasis, and also using it to heighten the sense of the conceptual idea that they're trying to get across here. We can also see this a lot in web design, where landing pages are essentially created with a goal in mind. They want to create this user landing page that is going to create some specific action, like filling in a form or downloading an ebook. And that's why landing pages must be kept kind of simple and guide the visitor or the user to take this action. So the use of white space here in this landing page really focuses on this call to action here in the center, this sign up for free to download or learn more or set, whatever that may be within that specific website. We also have focal points within a composition. So there are dominant elements, and then there can also be additional focal points beyond that area of dominance. They may not have the same degree of dominance as the largest or the most important element on that page, but they can still be defined as focal points. Essentially, focal points are going to be areas of interest. So they can still be emphasized or created differently within a composition that sort of capture and hold the viewer's attention. So here we can see that there's a point of emphasis here within this design with a large red circle. It's a little bit brighter red. It's larger than the other elements on the composition. It's also a different shape than the other elements on the composition. But as we get into the other elements here, we see some additional focal points. We see these red squares that have some sort of relationship and stand out against the other gray squares there. So beyond points of emphasis, we can create focal points that still lead the viewer's eyes to give them all the information in that sequence that we intend to give them that sequence to. And again, we're creating contrast here. That contrast is going to be what separates these components from one another. And they don't need to be total opposites, but they can be. And we can use simple elements of contrast as far as big and small, classic and contemporary fonts, thin and thick lines, cool and warm colors, dark and light, smooth and rough textures. Any of these sort of opposites are going to create a crucial role in the organization of information on a page. And it gives that reader a guide on where to look first and what is going to be the most important point. And then from there, what is going to stand out the most beyond that. So in these two references here, we can see these large posters that utilize black and white to do the use of typography and scale with these large headlines and body copy that essentially creates some depth and a more dynamic layout within the use of this composition. So as we are working with hierarchy, and as a designer, it's important to think about how you are going to organize your information and start to assign a priority to the content that's going to be used in your composition. So you really want to take a step back and think about what is going to be necessary to be used to communicate your design, and then what is going to be the priority of those elements. And you may be able to reference the source of your content for inspiration of some sort of hierarchical structure, but we also want to think about our own designs as we're going into this particular assignment this week and additional assignments moving forward. So one of the things we're thinking about with hierarchy here is ways to organize information. And for this week's assignment, you are going to be creating a top 10 list using hierarchy and organizing information within a specific layout. So what we can take a note of is different ways of communicating that. And one is going to be using some sort of guidelines or some sort of alignment or grid structure within your design. So we can go back to the grids and modularity that we practiced and think about how we can align different elements as far as typography and imagery to communicate and create that structure within our design. You can also think about scale and emphasis to create these areas of dominance within the design, right? We are going to be using only grayscale for this, so we're not going to be using color. So we're really going to have to rely on this use of scale and white space and different styles of typography and typography settings to create that sense of focal points and emphasis within the composition. So you should be relying on some sort of guides to assist you in your design, whether this is some sort of larger grid structure or simply some sort of guidelines here. This is going to be an important aspect of organizing your layout. So please adhere to these sort of guides or grid structure for the bulk of your content. And to think back on the guides and grid structures that we've talked about, typically we're going to be utilizing the typography boxes within those different modules or those spatial zones of that grid structure. So here we can see an example of this modular grid structure here, where the text boxes are either being used in one single module or expanding to multiple modules while still allowing for those gutters to be clear and separate the information. And we can see these dominant focal points here as well. This main headline that is letting you know what this is about, the subheader, which is giving you a little bit more information, some sort of caption over here to the side, and then your body copy or your primary text that's being used. So thinking back to that grids and modularity practice here, we were experimenting with this with the use of imagery and text. And although we're not going to be using imagery in this practice, the same principles are going to apply with that use of alignment within your composition that I want you to focus on. Another thing that we need to do is consider the fonts that you're going to use. You're going to have quite a bit of content that's going to span the use of several levels of hierarchy. So you're going to want to choose a typeface that is simple and will work in large areas of text or body copy, along with larger areas of headlines and subheaders. So the font that you use for your body copy in your print or your web projects should be unobtrusive. You should save the more decorative and display fonts for things like headlines or other elements that require some sort of emphasis and can show that typeface in a little bit more detail, typically at a larger scale or larger size. And many suitable fonts are going to be available for your body copy. This is an example here of Avenir, which we can see is very versatile and works both as a header, a subheader, and body copy. And we have different point sizes and different styles or fonts within this typeface here. Over on the left, we have a 48 point size and a Avenir Next Heavy, meaning it's a much thicker version of that font. For the subheader, we have a slightly smaller 26-point size and a demi-bold, so it's not quite as thick. And then for the body copy, we have a 14-point size at a regular type size setting here. So we can see how one single typeface can span all three of these different levels of hierarchy and still be very legible while creating strong points of dominance and emphasis within the design itself. We also want to think about the type of typefaces we're using and creating contrast within the design. So you want to think about using typefaces that are going to look different from one another. We don't want to pick typefaces that are going to be very similar because that's not going to create that contrast that we are desiring. So oftentimes we can rely on choosing contrasting typefaces from different styles, such as a serif and a sans serif typeface. As we can see over here on the left, sans serif typefaces have those serifs at the end of the brackets, either some sort of bracketed terminal or ball terminal that we can see. And over on the right, we can see that a sans serif is absent of any of those additional brackets. And typically serifs are going to be a little more contrasting as far as using thick and thin lines, where sans serifs are going to be a little more universal within the actual stems and the different components of those typographic elements. So you may want to choose one of each style to create that contrast within your design. We also want to think about typefaces that we want to steer away from. We don't want to use typefaces that potentially have a negative connotation within the design field. And this is hard to know off the bat. So your best bet is to go with typefaces that are a little bit more standardized and not try to get too decorative when you're beginning the use of your typography in your own graphic design. These are a few examples of typefaces that sort of have a bad connotation within the design world, and we typically want to stay away from in the use of our designs. So a couple of ways that we can create that hierarchy within our text and our formatting is through the type formatting itself. And one way to do that is to adjust the way that we are positioning the letters and the typography within the page. And the first thing we're going to look at here is kerning. And kerning is referred to within typography as the space between two individual letters. It's going to be used when you need to move only one letter because it is either too far or too close to its companions. And we can see an example of that here. A lot of times when typefaces are created, they are created with default spacing around them. And sometimes two different letters that might have similar shapes or create interesting relationships when positioned next to each other might create larger or shorter gaps that you may need to go in and adjust. And we can see that being done here, where the L and the A are very close together at the bottom. And because of the default positioning, the A and the V are very far apart. So you may need to go in and bring those letters closer together. Now, this is not going to be so important with areas such as body copy, but when you get into headlines and areas where the text is very large, this becomes much more apparent. Now, in addition to kerning, we also have tracking. This is going to be similar to kerning, but this is actually the spacing between all the different letters within a specific word or line of text. So now we can see that tracking actually has to do with the spacing between all of the different letters, or again, words within the line of text itself. And this is, again, something to be aware of, specifically when you are using script fonts, which have a specific styling as far as their relationship to one another. And you can see when the tracking is very far apart on the left, the intended styling of these script fonts loses that significance there. And when it's brought back together, as its appropriate tracking is, we can see on the right, a much more appropriate relationship between each one of these letter forms. We also have leading. Leading is going to be the space between the baselines. This means that when we manipulate the leading, we're actually changing the way the paragraph looks. So this is going to take up more space within the composition, but it's also going to give more space for each line of text, which can be easier to read for a viewer. So over here on the left, we can see a very tight leading where each one of these baselines is fairly close to one another. And if we increase that leading, or the spacing between each line of text, we can see that it becomes a little bit easier to read for this body of text here. So these are some of the practices that you're going to be doing in the hierarchy top 10 list assignment for this module. So for this exercise, you're going to be developing typographic hierarchy and practicing how you can control the way the viewers understand and read information. And this is a really important part of successful communication and a large part of what you will be doing as a graphic designer and a visual communicator. So to begin this exercise, you're going to start by finding a top 10 list online to reference. And essentially anyone will work. Make sure that it is classroom appropriate. We'll be using the text that you find within this reference for the content of this exercise. So the list must have an overarching title. It must have 10 topics that are covered and a bit of descriptive text about each item on the list. So we will use these items to build a structure of strong hierarchy that sets a clear prioritization of this information. The format for this project is going to be a tabloid size document, which is 11 inches by 17 inches. You can use either landscape or portrait, meaning it can be either horizontal or vertical in the actual layout itself. And a couple of things to explore are, one, the placement on the page, so how this information is going to be organized. The grid structure and the overall alignment of these 10 different items, the scale and the weight to control the hierarchy within the typography itself, utilizing space and different type styles or fonts to build a typographic system. And then there's also a few things to avoid. We are only using grayscale, so only white, black, and variations of black, any grays in between. So no color or any imagery, we're only using text. We also want to avoid any widows, which are going to be words that stand alone or appear at the bottom of a paragraph or sentence by themselves. In addition to that, we also want to avoid any orphans, which are going to be any lone words that appear at the top of a page or a column by itself. So we want to make sure that the information is sticking within the appropriate paragraphs, and the lines of text are going to end with more than one word at the bottom of each one of those lines. And I have some examples for you in the module, and we'll take a look at this one here. This is an example of a top 10 list of tourist attractions in California. And we can see that the title is the largest dominant element on here. It creates that strong point of emphasis. And they've actually chosen to position this within the center of the page here. And they have a clear hierarchy structure beyond that. There's a subheader up here at the very top, which gives some information about what this top 10 list is about, and it's slightly larger. And then within the actual structure of each one of the 10 items in this list, there's also an additional hierarchy. There is a number that is in a slightly different value of black and in a different weight of the typeface, as well as a different size. Then there's also the title for that specific item within the top 10 list, which is slightly larger and in dark black there. And then we see the body copy, the short description for each one of the top 10 items here, which is going to be the smallest text on the screen and also going to have a more regular or lighter weight to it than some of the other components. So this is what we are trying to work through here. We're trying to create that hierarchical structure within the different contents of the top 10 list that you are referencing for this particular assignment. So again, your first step is going to be to research and find a top 10 list to use for this assignment. Make sure that your top 10 list has at least some sort of titling system on it, some sort of title for each element within the top 10 list, and some sort of description for each element within the top 10 list as well, so that we can explore this typography. We are going to be using InDesign to work on this assignment, so make sure that you have your Adobe Creative Cloud subscription set up and your Adobe InDesign program downloaded, and I will be providing an additional tutorial for that software as well. So please let me know if you have any questions.